let me introduce Robert Muise. He's been Chief Counsel in this case. He's with the American Freedom Law Center. Robert Muise.
Thank you, Father Pavone. You know, it's always a great day when you get to stand up for religious freedom, and we got to do that today. We got our day in court. It's been an absolute honor and privilege of mine to represent Priests for Life in this very important case. As I stated in the court, I mean, when you think about all the organizations that are challenging this mandate, who better to challenge it than Priests for Life? Because this goes right to the core of what they do. It's antithetical to their very mission of promoting the gospel of life. And, you know, Father Pavone, I should have put him up at the podium. He did a wonderful job articulating what the arguments are. And really what it boils down to, what I said finally in my rebuttal. And that is under the law, it is not the role of the government, it's not the role of the courts to decide what does or does not violate the doctrines of the Catholic Church. That is the claimant's. That is Priests for Life's decision alone. It is not the decision of the government to make. The role of the court here, then, is to decide, knowing that this so-called accommodation violates their fundamental religious beliefs, does the government then impose a substantial burden on those beliefs? And the courts have likewise said quite clearly that when the religious believer is faced with the Hobson's choice, here that choice being you either violate the sacred tenets of your faith or you pay crippling fines, that as a matter of law is a substantial burden. And so hopefully at the end of the day the court will follow what the law says, what the facts are in this case, and that we will ultimately prevail. And prevail not just for Priests for Life, but prevail for all Americans who value freedom, in particular our first freedom, and that is the right to free exercise of religion. I'm open for any questions. Anybody has any questions about anything that occurred during the course of the hearing? Yes, sir.
Under the current scheme, who's paying for the contraceptive services if you lose this case?
The question was, if we lose this case, who's paying for the contraceptive services? The reality is, if we lose this case, then Priests for Life is going to be in a very difficult position, that Hobson's choice that I mentioned before, because under the law, that if they don't abide by this accommodation, which they won't, they've stated emphatically they will not because it violates their beliefs, then they are subject to penalties of $100 per day per affected employee that is not receiving the contraceptive coverage. The only other option would be to drop health care altogether. And when you think about how ironic that is, right? The Affordable Care Act was supposed to design to ensure that more Americans are covered and that the health care is more affordable. Yet because of the ideology of this administration wanting to force this contraception mandate, it's going to have just the opposite effect. Now, I'm hopeful at the end of the day that we are ultimately going to prevail. So at the end of the day, they will not be providing contraceptive services, but they cannot provide it, and they will not abide by the accommodation. So they're going to end up having to pay penalties or decide that they're going to have to drop health care altogether, which would be horrific. Yes, sir.
Can you talk more about the specific doctrine that you'd be going against by complying?
It's the specific doctrine we would be going against by complying with this, first of all, rests on the Church's opposition to abortion, many of these drugs causing abortion, and contraception. First of all, that these things should not be expanded. We're being asked to cooperate in a plan that does expand them. Secondly, the doctrine of religious freedom itself, that because we cannot do anything that expands these activities, therefore freedom of religion means we can't be compelled to engage in any such activity that facilitates, impels, or furthers such a plan. Most specifically, it's the teaching about cooperation in evil. When someone else is performing an evil act, so in this case, the government expanding the abortion and contraception that is taking place in this country, then a believer may not participate in that directly and formally, that is, by agreeing with it, or by an action which, even though they don't agree with it, is necessary for it to happen. So, in other words, if I know that you're about to shoot an innocent person and you say to me, give me a gun, I don't agree with what you're about to do, and therefore even if I don't agree, if I hand you that gun, I have become guilty of that act of murder because I put into your hands what was necessary for you to carry it out. I didn't agree with it. I didn't actually pull the trigger, but I gave you the necessary means to do it. And so the doctrine of cooperation is what is at issue here. And that point about the action being necessary is also what is at issue. Because in this, the arguments that were just held, our side of the arguments quoted from the Affordable Care Act and the provisions where it says that once we fill out the self-certification form that says we object, then a series of events is triggered by that action whereby the insurer must provide the coverage to the employee over and above our objections. So if our act is necessary for that coverage to happen, that's where the doctrine on cooperation says we may not act. If we're given an exemption, on the other hand, and we're told, like a church is told, you can go ahead and continue to insure your employees, and there's no coverage whatsoever for these objectionable activities, period, amen, and you don't have to do or say anything else beyond that. And then the government goes directly to our employees and says, listen, if you want this coverage, just ask for it yourself. Well, we wouldn't agree with them doing that, but not, on the other hand, that wouldn't implicate us in any kind of activity of cooperation. So that's the kind of doctrines we're talking about.
How many employees do you have?
Preach for Life right now, depending on how you count them, hovers right around 50.
How is this going to be addressed on other issues? You've got this one issue with the birth control, but what about other issues that might be objectionable to the legislature behind Preach for Life and Affordable Care?
Yes, the Affordable Care Act, as we know, is a forest of various provisions, not all of which we either understand or have seen the implications of. So, will there be other aspects of this that we will object to? Certainly. And there are a lot of fundamental questions at issue that we're dealing with. Any time that any of these provisions substantially burden our religious beliefs, we will not cooperate and we will object to them. It just so happens that this one lends itself, because of the circumstances, to an immediate court challenge.